Chapter 11. Heir apparent. Coronation in Estolia always takes place on the same day, and usually in the same ceremony, wherein the heir apparent receives his birth blessing, 7 days after his birth. This has not changed in 66 generations, and it will not change in the future. The ceremony is subject to the whims of the Strellarin as to the order of events, the location, and other important details. It is, however, one of the most satisfying ceremonies for all Estolians, knowing that their newest monarch has fulfilled the promise of Zacharias, and guaranteed the citizenry another 30 years of peace and prosperity. Malachi Tobias Zacharian, Capitulo 66. Shortly after the airplane taxied to a halt, the stewardess opened the door. Cassie was eager to disembark. Lilane felt a sense of adventure to be visiting this strange land with such peculiar customs. As she approached the door, she told herself firmly that she would enjoy every minute, store up every memory, and not worry about the minutiae of fitting in, proper behavior, or anything else. She would focus on having fun and let the future direct itself for the duration of the visit. Several horse-drawn carriages greeted them, as well as an assemblage of individuals who looked very much like they must be members of the ruling class. Cassie might be more than simply the niece of the last resort. Remembering her vow to enjoy every element of her unusual vacation, she lifted her chin slightly and smiled more broadly. Cassie grinned at her and they began to descend the stairs, carefully due to the voluminous skirts they both wore. At the bottom of the stairs, Cassie grabbed Lilane's hand and led her towards the man at the head of the small group. He was wearing a richly embroidered cape, a ceremonial sword, and a crown. He looked very much like he could be a prince or a king. Cassie launched herself into his arms, receiving a loving embrace. With her arm around his waist she said, "Lilane, this is my father, Balthazar Leopold Zacharian, Duke, Sovereign, and King of Estolia. Father, this is Taryn Lilane, a protégé of Eduardo Lestalt. She prefers to go by the name of Lilane." She was still processing the implications of the introduction, that Cassie's father was the king, when he hugged her and kissed her on both cheeks and smiled into her eyes. "I hope I may call you Lilane, and I would be pleased if you would do me the honor of calling me Leo." Lilane saw sincerity and genuine pleasure in his eyes and said, "Thank you." With his arm around her shoulders, he guided her to another man who looked very similar to him, with slightly longer blonde hair, a goatee, and wearing purple and green robes that looked vaguely religious, something like the robes of a monk. A black sash went from his right shoulder down to his left hip. "May I present my brother, Theobald Reginald Zacharian, my first consul, my last resort, and keeper of the soul of Estolia. Theo, this is Taryn Lilane." He gripped both of her hands and held them for an extended time, his eyes searching hers. When he finally spoke, she could tell that something had disturbed him in some way. With a strange note in his voice, he said to her, "I am pleased to meet you, Taryn Lilane. I see now why our good friend Eduardo felt you should visit Estolia. You could easily be a daughter of Estolia. In truth, you honor us by your presence." He smiled before asking her, "Will you do me the greatest honor and allow me to give you a formal blessing during your visit?" He must have sensed her reluctance. He added, "You would sit in a special chair, and I and my nephew would place our hands upon your head. We would then say a special prayer in the Estolian language. As a further gift to you, you would be presented with a scroll containing the words of the blessing, in both Estolian as well as the best possible translation into English. It would not take more than half an hour of your time, but it would give me great pleasure." Lilane nodded acquiescence. "I should like, now, to introduce you to Lazarus Ezekiel Zacharian, my nephew, and Cassie's younger brother. He is my assistant and will soon take on the role of last resort. Eventually, he will take over my positions as first consul and keeper. Zeke, this is Taryn Lilane." He was in his late 20s with light brown, almost blonde hair, and amber-colored eyes. He pulled her into his arms for a hug and then looked at her with the same intensity of purpose, if only for a moment before he grinned at his uncle. "I see what you mean, Uncle Theo." The last person to greet her stepped forward. Whereas Zeke was dressed reminiscent of the monk, this man was dressed in the style of the king, with a similar cape and ornamental sword. He did not have a crown. His hair was a deep mahogany with incongruous light grey eyes. His eyes met hers with a peculiar intensity. The king stepped forward again and said to her, "This is my oldest son, heir to the throne, he whose burdens and blessings are the greatest in the service of Estolia. Isaiah Monterey Zakarian. Isaiah, may I present the delightful Taryn Lilane who comes to us as a visitor, but who is worthy to be called a daughter of Estolia." He smiled and leaned forward to press his cheek briefly to her own. "I am delighted to meet you, Taryn Lilane. Welcome to Estolia. We are truly blessed by your visit. You light up our nation with the radiant beauty of your aura." He turned and smiled at his father before asking Lilane, "I would be delighted if you would ride back to the palace with me in my carriage." Lilane took his arm, feeling the lean strength of his flesh beneath the trappings of civilization. She felt the heat of a blush on her face as she climbed into the foremost open-topped carriage. Once she was seated, Isaiah sat across from her and the carriage started out with a couple of men on horseback leading the way. For a while they traveled in silence. Lilane looked at the beautiful countryside. Finally, her attention turned to the handsome man seated across from her. "Your family is very generous. Cassie seems a most extraordinary person. I'm glad I had the chance to meet her. Eduardo is a great family friend. He has never recommended any person to our family who is unworthy of our friendship. We are grateful you have allowed us to share our country with you." "What is this ceremony that is taking place this week?" she asked. "I will be turning 30 in 5 days. The day before my birthday, my uncle Theo will pass the position of last resort to my brother Zeke. This is what we will be celebrating. Uncle Theo will instruct Zeke in giving a royal blessing. Did he make you uncomfortable with his request?" One of his eyebrows quirked upward. "Not really. I don't mind receiving a blessing." She decided to share with him, "I plan to enjoy every minute of my unexpected vacation. I might not want to leave at the end of my stay." Isaiah's eyes were warm on hers as he said, "I have no doubt that you will feel as though this is your home by the end of the week. You will always be welcome in Estolia." Turning slightly, he gestured ahead of the carriage. The carriage was now traveling down a narrow valley. To their left was a beautiful structure that looked like a cathedral. On their right, the road they were on was heading up the side of the mountain. She followed the meandering road with her eyes, and when she reached the end her breath left her in a long drawn-out sound of appreciation. Atop the mountain was an immense turreted palace with a pyramid-like peak. From their vantage point it looked enormous, larger than life. "I have lived my entire life in the palace. I often forget how magnificent it is. It is only when we have visitors like yourself that I am reminded how truly unique it is." When they arrived in the forecourt, he climbed out of the carriage and then turned to offer her a hand so he could help her disembark. Once she was safely on the ground, he put an arm around her shoulders and turned her towards the front of the palace. It was extraordinary. Too much to take in at once, with arches, columns, and towers. In addition, it was pristine, as if it was only just constructed. They stood near a set of stairs that came together where they were standing. About a dozen or so steps up, the stairs split in two, one set going to the right, one to the left. Where they split was a remarkable carving of a flag with strange writing beneath it. The dual staircase climbed for some distance and then doubled back, meeting up just as the stairs reached the third level in front of the main entrance to the palace. While Lilane was admiring the architecture, a beautiful woman descended the stairs. She reached them just as Cassie, her father, brother, and uncle all climbed out of the second carriage and joined them. Isaiah placed a hand between Lilane's shoulder blades and urged her towards the woman. "Lilane, this is my mother, Jacqueline Cathay Zakarian, Queen of Estolia, my father's Kaylee. She prefers to go by the name of Jackie. Mother, this is Taryn Lilane, who, as I understand it, prefers the name Lilane." She was beautiful. She had thick chocolate brown curly hair with only a few strands turning silver with age, a willowy body, and warm brown eyes. Lilane, it is such a pleasure to meet you. Eduardo was most impressed with you, and we're delighted to show off our tiny country to you. While she was speaking, another individual descended the staircase, and she turned to him. This is a distant relative from France, Morgan Luc Dumaine. Morgan, may I present my daughter, Cassiopeia Zakarian, and her friend Taryn Lilane. Enchanté, he said in French, before adding in English, it is a delight to meet two lovely young ladies. Lilane was enthralled by the extraordinarily fine architecture, the intricate stone carvings and beautiful statues. She smiled at Isaiah, saying, "It's marvelous." "I am glad you like my home," he said with a wide smile. They all began the climb up the many steps leading to the grand entrance. Lilane's hand on Isaiah's sleeve, Cassie's hand on Morgan's.